Hello, welcome to the Ponderings podcast. I'm your host, Milo. In this episode, I'm going to be elaborating on James Hillman's conception of Anima Mundi. Basically, just go more in depth on what he means when he talks about the soul or psyche or soul making. And I'll be touching upon enactivism and embodied cognitive science in order to explain Hillman's conception of Anima Mundi and the world soul, sort of give it some grounding. You can find this podcast on any podcast hosting site such as Anchor, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, etc. I also post videos on YouTube of the podcast every week on Mondays. So first I want to share a quote from the ancient Greek philosopher Thales. Quote, "The whole world is full of gods," unquote. Archetypal psychology takes up this animistic idea that the world itself and its particulars has soul. And by soul, I mean mind, cognition, consciousness, or to put it more simply, aliveness. Nature is alive, and it has varying degrees of aliveness. There is mind in life, and vice versa. So before I get into more psychological or philosophical notions in James Hillman's work, I just want to define this basic idea of nature being alive. And in order to do that, I'm going to go over Evan Thompson's conception of embodied cognition and enactivism in his book Mind and Life. And I'm going to use that to define his enactivist approach, as well as define animism in its more mythic and religious context to tie all that together near the end. So, yeah, it'll sort of all tie together to give us an idea of what Hillman means by the world, soul, Anima Mundi. Alright, so I'm gonna begin talking about Thompson's enactive approach. So bear with me, there's gonna be a lot of information, but it's very interesting if you haven't heard of like embodied cognition. To begin, let's define inaction. So inaction primarily means the action of enacting a law, performing or carrying out an action. This approach was first coined by Varela, Roche, and Thompson in their book The Embodied Mind in 1991. 5 ideas are laid out to define this enactive approach. So this approach is a biological notion, but also extends to biology's dependency on its immediate situated environment and vice versa. So first, living beings are autonomous agents that self-organize and self-maintain themselves. This first idea is explicated in the term autopoiesis, which was first coined by Francisco Varela and Humberto Maturana. So autopoiesis basically means self-creating. So auto would be like yourself, right? And then poiesis is sort of a creation, making, self-making. For example, a cell is able to maintain and organize itself through chemical processes. Therefore, it is autonomous, but it is coupled to its environment. So, because it has a semi-permeable membrane, which allows it to pick and choose what it releases and what it receives from its environment. It has ways of reproducing, and all these things highlight the cell's skillful know-how in its self-organization and its maintenance through interaction with the environment. So again, that first idea to this enactive approach has to do with autopoiesis, getting that sort of concept, laying out what this concept means, autopoiesis. So the second idea is the nervous system self-organizes and maintains itself, and is an autonomous dynamic system, meaning it actively organizes and maintains its own coherent and meaningful patterns of activity. So it's a circular network of interacting neurons. So here we're thinking bigger than just the cell. We're thinking about the nervous system, which has a centralized or contained structure in that it is able to coordinate the activity of neurons in the body of an organism. So other systems in the body, such as muscles, organs, endocrine system, etc., these would all apply to this sort of second idea where now all these cells are kind of working in conjunction, or a sort of intentional pattern. It's like a multicellular system that is happening that has a centralized sort of core, or a centralized coordination going on. So these are all autonomous, but they work in conjunction. They intentionally work with the organism as a whole. So yeah, we have the sort of individual cells, self-maintaining but still coupled to the environment, and then we have cells that sort of work together as like muscles, organs, endocrine systems, different systems to create a coordination in the body. So the third idea has to do with cognition. It's the skillful know-how of this autonomous agent in its situated and embodied action. So it's even bigger than just the differing systems in the body. This third idea is the organism as a whole and its interaction with the environment, and how this organism is able to maneuver intentionally. So here, it's not just the separate systems like working on their own, maintaining on their own, but all these systems come together to form a sort of organism. But still, there's all these processes going on, so these aren't separate things in the organism. They're made up of very complex processes, going from simple processes of just like a cell, or just like molecules going in and out of cells or things like that, or from the environment, passing through skin and things like that. And then there's more complex systems like the skin, muscles, nervous system, and then there's even more complexity when all these systems sort of work in conjunction to coordinate activity and sort of be a more cohesive whole, which is like the organism. The organism is a more cohesive whole with all these systems, but it's still dependent on all these systems to work or to function, and it's also dependent on the environment to provide like the different chemical processes and all these things. All right, so fourth, this organism is a cognitive being. So even an ant or plants they have a level of cognition. It might not be as complex as like a human organism, but a plant has its own sort of ability to cognize or sort of coordinate activity, even if it's less centralized than like an animal or a human. So yeah, the cognitive being's world is not a pre-specified external realm that is represented by its brain. So here we have the organism, the outside, or the plants, animals, environment that it is in. It's not an external realm to the organism. It's actually a relational domain that is enacted or brought forth by the organism's mode of coupling with the environment. So as an organism, the environment, the way we perceive the environment, it's not this external thing, but it's something that the way we perceive it as affordances, what we're able to do in the environment, how we're able to use or interact with this environment. It's very interaction based. It's very relationally based. So a bird would perceive its environment very differently than a human. A bird would see things having to do with its own abilities. So this would have to do with the organism's ability and also the organism's way of interacting with the environment. The environment that the organism perceives or interacts with is going to be very specific to the organism's abilities. Like, for instance, animals or plants even, but specifically animals, they have different capabilities with their senses. Some can smell more than we can or see differently than we can. So the environment that they are interacting with is going to be very distinct to their perception or sensory motor capacities. But again, it's not this like substance. We can't think of it as substances like there's plants there, there's animals there, there's, the outside, there's me. No, it's a relational domain that is very interdependent, and sort of as I create the environment that I see and affect it as I live and take and give from it, the environment also changes me. So we have to see it as a relational domain instead of this like external realm and then there's me kind of thing. So yeah, this idea of this relational domain, that's important. There are no separate substances out there. Nothing in life is independent. There is no bifurcation or division between mind and body. Mind and body are continuous, and they extend into this relational domain, coupling with the environment, which consists of other autonomous systems that are also coupled to the environment and to you. Obviously, these couplings aren't happening simultaneously all at the same time. It's what you're giving attention to. It's what you're it's in the specific environment that you're in. But again, even if something is far away, there's a way that you affect it or touch it just by affecting your nearby environment. That nearby environment will be affecting its other nearby environment, and so on and so forth. And so that's the fourth idea. Okay. And the fifth idea is that experience is not a side issue or a derivative of life, but rather experience is the central component to understanding mind. This fifth idea highlights the importance of combining phenomenology and cognitive science to have a more in-depth understanding of mind. Phenomenology is the study of direct experience. It's the study of phenomena as it appears to us. So this sort of ties back to Hillman's quote, the stick with the image. So, and I'll get into that a little more later, but sort of the fifth idea is this. It's the experience is essential component to understanding mind, and phenomenology is sort of this way of that we can understand the phenomena, or at least express it or talk about it. We have to talk about it as it appears to us. But again, this would only apply to humans' experience. We can't really explain the experience of animals or plants or how the environment as a whole experiences us, but we can sort of learn from our own experience and study that. So enactivism is very closely tied to phenomenology and applying phenomenology to cognitive science. The enactivist approach proposes that there is a deep continuity of life and mind, and that autonomy is a fundamental characteristic of biological life specifically. And then we still have to keep in mind that relational domain. It's very relational. Even this autonomy that we perceive, this sort of unity, isn't really it's made up of very complex systems, or it can be broken down further and further, and there's still a lot of relational aspects going on. It's not just like this independent substance by itself. And phenomenology proposes that intentionality is the fundamental characteristic of the lived body. So again, intentionality, in order to study our direct experience, we have to pay attention or kind of have a focus or an intentional focus on the phenomena or how we experience things or what is being experienced. There is autonomy and intentionality in life, specifically in the organism, in one's subjectively lived body. And this life world is going to lead us to that, to Hillman's conception of Anima Mundi, which is the world soul. So now we're going to take the psychological approach, now that we've gone over the cognitive science and sort of physiological way of understanding how everything's interconnected and is a part of a relational domain. Psychology is the study of the soul, the psyche. So with Thompson's enactivist approach in mind, cognition is embodied and it is also extended. There is no duality of mind and body. It is continuous. Hillman suggests that psychology is in need of soul, so keeping this continuous mind and body will help us understand what Hillman means when he's talking about soul. So Hillman, unlike Thompson, suggests that the soul should not be reduced to personal subjectivity, and that personalism is a burden on modern psychology. So in cognitive science, there's still a very strong emphasis on physicality, and Hillman Hillman specifically, if you're comparing it to cognitive science, he's going to differ because he wants to focus on language and the imaginal realm and myths and how they create our cultures and things like that. So it's a more social science, really, where Hillman is coming from. Okay, so on page 95 of A Blue Fire, Hillman quotes, "The soul is not of itself personal. The psyche presents itself in images of persons and in personal feelings, but it is more than personal." Unquote. Carl Jung suggested we observe soul as its own objective psyche rather than a personal psyche. Soul contains its own history and purposes, and it inhabits its own terrain, its own situated environment. And specifically, Hillman believes that soul has its own reasons, its own intentionality. So soul isn't like one's personal soul, or how there's like this division between soul and body or something. That's not what Hillman is talking about. When Hillman talks about soul, it has more to do with myth or essence. It has to do with the soul of an aspect of yourself, or the soul of the dream, or the soul of a culture, the soul of a teaching, the soul. It's a more animistic approach than sort of substance or a Christian like soul body kind of approach. The soul is still very much attached to the environment. It also creates its own environment, and Hillman suggests that there's like a soul-making process, and he wants to bring back soul to psychology because it feels like it's very psychology has focused more on physicality, or it's just taking the soul, the poetry, the art out of the study of mind. So now I can actually get into the Anima Mundi, the world soul. So in archetypal psychology, the world is seen as having its own soul and in need of therapeutic attention. Western civilization has taken the soul out of anything that is not human, basically claiming anything that is other as inanimate. Only the subjective person is able to have and create soul. And obviously Hillman will disagree with this notion, and he proposes that everything has soul, and they have soul in varying degrees. Again, when we speak of soul, according to Hillman, it is not the Christian conception of a soul, this thing in itself or inside us, but rather soul is more akin to the intentionality and relational domain proposed in the enactivist approach. Not only do we have subjectivity, but the world has its own subjectivity as well, in that the world isn't just a projection of our fantasies or perception onto it. Nature is alive with its own intentionality. And we can know this by the fact that of autopoiesis, that the smallest cells have, or the smallest molecular, there's intentionality happening. There's intentional movement and interaction, relations going on, even at the molecular level. But yeah, so again, nature is alive with its own intentionality. Soul is an opus, a work, according to Hillman. So culture is a perfect example of soul as an opus, a work. And culture is defined as the work of soul-making. The organism's subjective unity interacts and creates itself and its environment as much as the environment creates itself and the organisms in its relations. Soul does not only encompass this relational domain, but also the symbols and metaphors which emerge and are created through our interactions with our situated environment. Again, we go back to the Thales quote from the beginning of this episode. The whole world is full of gods. So there is imaginative possibility, and this imaginative possibility is soul-making. So I want to sort of go into a little bit of what animism is, and I'll probably dedicate a whole episode to animism at some point in the future, but here I'm just going to touch on it and sort of give Hillman's approach, or how he describes animism. But okay, so currently the Western perception of psychic reality is that there is a system of private experiencing subjects and dead public objects. Animism is a term coined by cultural anthropologists, which means that everything such as animals, plants, rocks, rivers, weather systems, humans, even words are animated and alive. So instead of the normal Western perception where, there's experiencing subjects and dead public objects, animism actually says that everything is alive. It's animated. So this doesn't mean that we're going to anthropomorphize rocks or rivers, but they have a degree of aliveness. There's a degree of complexity, of a sort of consciousness with rivers, weather systems. There's movement and intentionality happening, but they're not dead public objects as the Western perception usually sees it. So I think James Hillman, again, he describes this best on his quote on page 99 of A Blue Fire. So, quote, "The world comes with shapes, colors, atmospheres, textures, a display of self-presenting forms. All things show faces. The world not only a coded signature to be read for meaning, but a physiognomy to be faced. As expressive forms, things speak. They show the shape they are in. They announce themselves, bear witness to their presence. Look, here we are. They regard us beyond how we may regard them. Our perspectives, what we intend with them, and how we dispose of them. This imaginative claim on attention bespeaks a world ensouled. More, our imaginative recognition, the childlike act of imagining the world, animates the world and returns it to soul." Unquote. So nature calls for us to notice it. It claims our attention, revealing its own face, its own experience. And this requires us to notice the other as its own, as having its own soul, its own experience which projects back to us, rather than us projecting our own subjectivity towards it. So again, it's not about anthropomorphizing rocks or rivers, but noticing that there's aliveness going on even in rocks, with molecules that make up the rocks, or the history behind rocks, how they have built up over time, how rivers have changed over time. They have their own narratives, they have their own stories, and this is where myth and all that plays a part in Hillman's psychology. It's seeing the rivers, forests, all these environments, all these different organisms, seeing them for what they are, and then bearing witness to their presence, and how they announce themselves, looking at the faces that they show. And we're not reading for hidden messages or meanings, but just facing them for what they are, sticking with the image. Well, I hope that this episode has helped you understand Hillman's conception of world soul. Also, I hope the introduction on enactive and embodied cognitive science did not confuse you, but rather made the concept of world soul a bit more grounded. So that's why I used cognitive science to ground the concepts of soul, so it's not just this spiritual or new agey conception. Hillman isn't speaking of soul as like a interiority or substance, but it's a more poetic narrative sort of understanding of the face of the things around us, or how they want us to bear witness. They want us to intentionally pay attention, to interact, to notice. We're not just living in a personal, subjective experience, but things around us, the environment, plants, other people, other organisms are alive as well. Other weather systems, all these things are alive, and they have faces. They have faces for us to witness, and for us to notice, and for us to sort of listen to their narrative, whatever that may be, as it appears to us, or as it interacts with us, as it relates to us. Yeah, pretty cool. Hillman's work is very fascinating, and it brings, again, it's sort of bringing soul back to just the physiology. Of course, learning about physiology and cognitive science is magical and just beautiful in itself, but Hillman sort of takes the next step of giving narrative and poetry and myth, and acknowledging the importance of myth making and soul making, giving soul to these relations and this domain in which we inhabit and move. But yeah, thank you for listening, and I hope you stay tuned for the next episode.